Hello and good morning. Archbishop Richard Gagnon here, speaking to you from my residence in Winnipeg. This is our Friday report, and thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you for being very faithful to these Friday reports, because just a way that I can connect with parishioners in the Archdiocese and also share news of the Archdiocese and what we're doing currently, still affected by the coronavirus pandemic. So the first thing I just want to mention to you is that the great challenge of opening up our communities continues. And it is a challenge. We're now up to 50 people indoors and 100 people outdoors, and no limit to the number of people in their cars in the parking lot. And so I find that with some of the smaller parishes, particularly in the rural areas, that things are getting a little bit back to normal now, because the number 50 is much more flexible to deal with, and it's helpful, but it still demands attention, particularly with the protocols, or shall I say the guidelines in Manitoba that have to be followed. And I've shared with you in previous Friday reports some of the complications involved with opening up our communities. Easy to close down the public masses, but very difficult to reactivate our communities. And when it comes to the middle-sized and large parishes, it's a huge challenge. It really is a huge challenge that takes an awful lot of work and organization to do. And so our openings of parishes, our communities continues. Our Catholic schools have continued to be active, actually. Very happy about that. They have a very robust online learning program that has never ceased. It has continued right through the pandemic. I'm very happy to see that. And some of our Catholic schools have been able to have groups of children in their schools for teaching purposes, and that's been very successful as well. So that is a very positive thing to report. I would say too, I'm very pleased with the current kind of flexibility, a little bit more opening up of the institutions that affects our Catholic extended care, nursing homes, and so on, hospitals, which enable family members now to visit. Now, there's many restrictions still, but that's an opening up, and that's going in the right direction. And we want to encourage that, and we want to build upon that. So we're all waiting for the near future, when greater flexibility for visiting shut-ins, people in extended care nursing homes, will be much more amenable to pastoral visits as well. That's very, very important. Our Catholic Center has been open since June the 1st, restricted hours from 10 o'clock in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I've encouraged our parishes to have their parishes offices open, even though hours may be restricted. And also to continue to have churches open for people to visit as well. That's a very good practice that has grown in the Archdiocese since this pandemic. I continue to have meetings with the priests of the Archdiocese and lay leaders in our deanery meetings. There's 3 deanery meetings a week, always online, of course, but it gives me a good chance to hear what's happening in the various parishes, and gives me a good perspective and helps me in my planning and understanding what is happening at the parish level, in the local communities, and so on. Allowing for more time for planning, that's something I wrote down here. Even though we are not back at normal operational levels in terms of our Archdiocese, it is a time in which we're doing more planning. We're looking at our pastoral services. We're looking at the way that we operate as an Archdiocese, looking at ways that our Synod can be part of our recovery as an Archdiocese, moving more into the future. That's been very valuable. There's a bit more time now for that sort of thing, and I think that can be very good and very helpful. So there's 2 big questions here that we have that I've written down. I've received a few questions from people during the week also, but basically what we're dealing with here is really quite a new phenomenon, at least in our lifetime, in my lifetime, and most people's lifetime. How are we going to rebuild our active communities? That's a big question. How are we going to rebuild our active communities? That's something that presents a particular challenge to us. And how are we going to recover our community life? See, it just doesn't happen automatically. How are we going to recover our community life? In a certain sense, our communities, our parish communities, our schools, the Archdiocese as a whole, are really in a state of rehabilitation. It's almost as if you've had an accident, you've had an injury, and now you are recovering. And that's something new, because 5 months ago, we would have never thought of that. 5 months ago, we were concerned with, outreach, reaching out to others, concerned with evangelization, concerned with various programs in the Archdiocese. But this basic challenge of rehabilitation, a spiritual and social rehabilitation of our communities, is central to what we are doing. And so in a moment, I'm going to be speaking with Linda Chiupka over the computer and share that with you. And Linda's going to share with us some observations that she has had. And Linda is our coordinator for our Synod of the Archdiocese, of some of the lessons that we have learned during this time and maybe some signs of hope for the future. So before I have this interview with Linda, I did receive a few questions this week in the Archdiocese, and I'll do my best to respond to those questions. The first question is, with our province moving on to phase 3 of our reopening on June the 1st, will our churches also be able to increase the number of worshipers from 25 to 50 people indoors? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. And some of our pastors were waiting for that greater flexibility before they began to think about opening up some of their churches, particularly if there's a main parish and then there's 2 or 3 mission churches. Now it is allowing that flexibility to happen. So the answer to your question is yes. 50 right now is what is allowed indoors, 100 people outside, and certainly we have a few parishes who will be having outdoor masses, and that is a good sign as well, as long as the weather cooperates. The second question, why do you think sometimes it's easier for people in the media to attack the Catholic Church than other communities of faith? Well, that's a question, that's a big question, and I suppose as Catholics we often feel that sting of perhaps sometimes a hostility, you might say. Sometimes it's just an ambivalence on the part of people. But this has been part of our experience as Catholics for a very long time. Our Lord said to his followers that if they have persecuted me, they will persecute you. The Catholic Church has teachings that cover all of human life, all aspects of our life, and doesn't overlook anything. And so sometimes what the Church teaches and invites people to follow, many people disagree with. And so sometimes there's a certain sense of hostility there. And that's something that is present. But I think it challenges us in terms of our education and sharing the good news with others. Because often what people think about the Catholic Church and what they believe the Catholic Church believes is often not correct. That's why it's an opportunity to share, well, that's not quite right. That's not exactly what our church teaches. Our church teaches such and such, or this is why we teach that, And I think having that sense of being able to share with others the cause of your joy, share with others what you deeply believe, but that means that we must also be formed ourselves, we must educate ourselves, we must learn about our faith ourselves, ask questions about our faith ourselves. That's very important. So I think the question is a very, very good question. And we can either, run away from criticism, or you can hide from criticism, or you can embrace the criticism as an opportunity for evangelization. So there's a few thoughts there you might think about. And number 3, Archbishop Richard, you've met Pope Francis on a number of occasions. How is he like in person? And how many popes have you met? I've had the privilege of meeting 3 popes, St. John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and of course, Pope Francis a number of times. And Pope Francis is a very disarming individual. He's a man who makes you feel relaxed very easily. He's a very, very attentive listener. And you know something? He's very joyful. He really is. Often when you see pictures of the Pope, he's not smiling, but actually the Pope has a tremendous sense of humor and very, very light in his heart. He has a joyful heart. He carries many heavy burdens, of course. I can't imagine the burdens that he carries, actually. But he lives the gospel of joy. He lives that gospel of joy. And he's very attentive to small things. I remember once when I was speaking with Pope Francis with two other bishops. We were part of the small delegation from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. And I happened to mention that my mother had a particular admiration for him and what he teaches and how he teaches. He immediately got up from the desk and he went over to a bookshelf and he looked for a particular book and he brought it down, and it was his book on mercy. It's a small book on mercy, and he opened it up and he wrote a personal note to my mother and gave it to me. That's a kind of attentive and sensitive person that Pope Francis is. Well, thank you very much for these questions this week, and I always invite you to anybody who wants to send a question in as part of our Friday report. So right now we're going to have a little conversation with Linda about where we're going and also about the Synod and also about what some of the signs of hope are through this COVID-19 experience. Well, great. I'm just talking right now with Linda Chiupka, who is our coordinator for our implementation of our Synod. And this is one of the wonders of social communication. You can talk to people who are 2 hours away. And Linda is living near Brandon, and yet she's our coordinator for our Synod in the Archdiocese of Winnipeg. So thank you, Linda. Thank you, Linda, for joining us today. Much appreciated. Very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Wonderful. So anyways, basically, just want to get your thoughts a little bit on what you have learned from the COVID-19 experience relative to our community of faith, and what signs have you seen there that may lend some hope and help us when we think about rebuilding our communities now that will be helpful to us.
Well, I think the first thing that this whole COVID experience has taught us all is how connected we are. When they talk about the various viruses and how, the number of people that can be affected, COVID was really the first time I think we've ever seen interactions between people that had that effect on such a worldwide scale. We could almost see it moving across the world. So it really made us realize how connected we are, in a sense that it caused us to change our behavior. What was really interesting, I found, is that when people realized what they needed to do to stay safe, you didn't really hear a lot of talk about people being adamant about, I'm not able to take my flight, I'm not be able to do this or to do that. They were really good about following the instructions and making sure they were doing things to keep other people safe. I think the other thing it really taught us is how vulnerable we are and how fleeting the things that we take for granted really can be. So I think a lot of times people learn these in their own personal experiences, things that they go through. It was like we were all learning this lesson, or at least having the lesson that we already knew kind of reinforced at once on this just grand scale. Another thing I think that it really helped us realize is how much we need community. There a lot of times before you would hear in the news how, the amount of time people spent on social media, the amount of time people spent watching YouTube videos or gaming. And, Pope Francis spoke several times during his public audiences at St. Peter's, like, put away your cameras, just enjoy this moment, enjoy this experience. And what we found, I think the world found, is at least the people who were used to doing a lot of consuming social media, is that when that's all we had, it wasn't enough. You know, left on our own with everything going well, we tend to gravitate towards those things. But when that's all that we have, we tend to want the company of one another. So I think that was really interesting. And as soon as COVID hit, when you did look at social media, you didn't see the selfies and the pictures of food and those kinds of things that you saw previously. What you saw were people reaching out to others. You know, you saw musicians putting on concerts. You saw people reading or telling stories. And you saw occasions of people interacting with their neighbors in a way that fostered that sense of community while respecting those guidelines that we were asked to follow. And a perfect example of that is, you know, when you watch the pictures of the people in Italy who came onto their balconies to sing, you know, the national anthem and other songs that they all knew so that they could all come together. Um, I think another thing it taught us is that if you can make a difference, you should, you know? And so people were just they saw the need around. They saw all of these closures and they said, what can I do? You know, and in some cases it was helping a neighbor, picking up a prescription, picking up groceries. But even on a larger scale, it was companies saying, well, you know what, if we reconfigure our equipment, we can provide hand sanitizer. Or, you know what, we use masks for our operation, but we have extra and we can divert those to frontline workers. So I think that was really an important lesson, is that we all have the ability to step up and do something. And so we should. And I think the other lesson that we learned is how much we need God, because what you had is that when suddenly that opportunity was to go to church was removed, we didn't have that option for public worship, or when people were alone and feeling very vulnerable, although they did stay in, they stayed in it at a time when you naturally want to be with others to talk about this shared experience that you're going through. And not having that opportunity, a lot of times people were turning to God, they were looking to God for answers, whereas in the course of their daily life, maybe they wouldn't be doing that because everything is under control. So you have way more people watching masses online. Parishes were reporting more people watching online, the ones that televised, than what they would traditionally see in church on Sundays. So somebody was watching. And people were also going online looking for Bible study or participating in prayer groups. And those who did go to church on a regular basis, I think it gave us occasion to really recognize how much, even though we might not necessarily know the person in the pew next to us, and we might not interact with them anything more than, you know, shaking hands at the sign of peace, we missed that opportunity to worship together. And we certainly, at least I think, I and others that I've talked to, recognized how much for granted we take reception of the Eucharist, that joins us to God, but that also joins us to one another in community, and how quickly something like that that we've never really had to do without before can be taken away from us by the stroke of a pen, in a way that should make us realize how important it is to get this message out of what it means to be a Eucharistic people.
Yeah.
So those are some of the takeaways that I
Yeah, well,
noticed.
that's really good. You know, that's very thoughtful, and I know that you know, you've received feedback from people. I certainly have, and that whole sense of sensitivity to other people. You know, outreach, trying to be more effective in outreaching to those in need. Certainly a part of the Synod goals that we talked about, and a sensitivity to other people and the needs that people have, especially the marginalized, you know. And also during these days of the whole question of racism, you know, and the protests and things like that, not the violent protests, but those who are protesting legitimate needs in society, to be sensitive to those who are on the fringes and that sort of thing, also in a particular way connects with that, you know. So that is certainly something that is powerful. And your mentioning of the community, which we take for granted, but above all, the reality of the Eucharist. And So these are things, hopefully, that we can keep close to our hearts, and it can help us that whole quest to rebuild and reestablish our communities. Many of these things you talked about are still in effect, actually, because we're not out of the coronavirus pandemic as of yet. So I'm just curious too, Linda. You must have done some thinking a little bit on the question of the synod and how, in some way, that might relate to this question that we just talked about. Any thoughts in that area?
Well, the three big themes that came out of the synod were formation of the laity, passing on the faith, and reaching out to the peripheries. And when it comes to the formation of the laity, a lot of the formation we get happens at Sunday Mass. We're listening to the scriptures. We have a good priest who breaks it apart for us in the homily, and that's where we get a lot of our information. But when we didn't have access to that regular routine of going to Sunday Mass, people had to start taking ownership for their own formation. And so they did that by going online, looking for online masses, but they also did it by, logging in or taking advantage of the numerous resources that there are online. And I think it's developed for wanting to know more, that I think is really important. The second point about, passing on the faith, the people who had their children in Catholic schools or that sent their children to catechism classes, suddenly that was not an option. Everybody's at home, and all schooling, including faith formation, is happening for their children at home. And so, again, they had to take ownership of their children's faith. And I thought it was so beautiful how that happened, and how, resourceful people were, and the ideas they were coming up with, especially over Easter, where you see online stories of people, covering the crosses in their home during the Triduum to sort of get that sense of what it would be like if they were in church, or covering their windows for stained glass, or setting up little altars and that kind of thing. And, where the domestic church is something we sort of talked about as like a theory or as a model, suddenly people were having to live this in their homes. And so I think it'll be really, really helpful when we come together and talk about what it is to live as a domestic church. People are going to be coming from having experienced that. And in terms of living on, or dealing with people on the peripheries, we already spoke about some of the things that people were doing. But I think what it's also taught us, or helped us to realize, is that the isolation that we felt during those days of the initial lockdown, where we weren't going anywhere, we weren't seeing anyone, and we had this longing, not only for church, but just for community with one another, that's something that a lot of people experience every day.
Mm-hmm.
And even when things are back to normal, whatever normal looks like, they're still going to be confined to their homes, where they maybe don't have family visiting, and they don't have that opportunity to go out because of mobility issues or whatever. So I think it's going to make us much, much more sensitive to really the plight of those that are housebound, or people who are in personal care homes that don't have family coming to see them, people in the hospital whose family is far away. I think having lived for a very short time in a position where you can't see people, you can't be with those you love, will hopefully, make our hearts a little bit bigger.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. That's really good. Appreciate that. In the whole question of domestic church, the family is a domestic church, the smallest unit of the church and of society, is an important takeaway from this, as well, as you mentioned there quite well. So that's helpful. That's very helpful, because in a funny sort of way, with the negative aspects of the corona virus, there's also these positive developments that we've been talking about in our synod, so that God's blessings are always in the midst of pain and suffering as well, for sure. And the last little question is just a curiosity here. You wrote something in On the Way magazine for the Archdiocese about your reflections on that biblical motif of the Exodus and how that might relate in some ways to our experience of this corona virus pandemic and how that connects with our faith. Maybe you may want to say a word or two about that.
Okay, well, that'll be kind of a teaser because, of course, that magazine's not out yet, right? It won't be out.
It's an advertisement ahead of time, so.
Yeah, exactly. But, where that came from is when this coronavirus hit and the world, the world in general and even our province of Manitoba sort of was shut down very suddenly. And, people had to work from home and all of these kinds of things. And the work that I was doing, of course, that was supposed to be supporting people with the Synod suddenly came to a halt because now people aren't congregating in the churches. So all of the meetings that weren't deemed necessary stopped. And so it came from a question of, if this was the will of God, if the Synod was the will of God, as I believe it was, led by God, then why would he allow it to come to this grinding halt, And so I looked for like a scriptural parallel, and where that led me to was the Exodus, because there again, you have a movement or a journey that's initiated by God that starts off with this big bang, right? All of these thousands and thousands of people leaving Pharaoh and going to their freedom, being led by God. But then they end up wandering around the desert for 40 years. So, what happened there? And so going into the story, I think there's deeper parallels than that too. And that when they first left their captivity in Egypt, they could have taken a direct route. But that route would have put them into conflict with the Philistines that were warring at that time. And, God said to Moses, if the people who've been, subservient for over 400 years come up against these people, having been slaves for so long, they weren't really prepared to deal with conflict. They likely would have gone running back to Egypt for protection, being like the superpower of the world, right? So instead, God tells Moses to go into the desert, which avoids that conflict, but it also allows them time to be away to break that dependency they had on Egypt, who, although Egypt was had them in slavery, also provided all the food for them. They were protected by the pagan gods. They participated in pagan rituals. So there was a need to sort of break from that old way of life and to learn to trust God and to stay together as a people, because if they would have gone off on their own or scattered, they wouldn't have survived in the desert. They survived in the desert because God was taking care of them. So it made me wonder, we started off on this journey. Is it possible that God knows of something that's coming up that maybe we're not really spiritually prepared for, that requires that we develop more of a dependence on him and a recognition of us as a people that need to stick together, to do our work? Of course, the Israelites, they had a tough time learning some of those lessons, and so they argued amongst themselves. They clung to pagan rituals. They questioned Moses. They, lambasted God for not giving them a better diet, kind of thing. So they weren't all that cooperative, And then when he finally got them to the promised land, they refused to enter, and which is what led to their 40 years wandering in the desert. I don't think God didn't intend that, but that's what it was required for them to come together as a people and to learn to rely on him. So if we can learn from that experience and learn from this whole experience that we've been through in COVID, I think the important lessons for us are that the great need for God, especially for receiving God in the Eucharist as a Catholic people, and to grow in understanding of how the Holy Eucharist connects us with God, but also to one another, and gives us the strength to do the will of God, which is to, make missionary disciples and create a just society. So if we can do that, then hopefully, Synod implementation won't take 40 years. This will just be a little rest stop on what is otherwise a very productive journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Christian looks at all of the scriptures and tries to determine what God is saying to them in scripture. And certainly there are many lessons that we can learn from that. When we advertise and try to encourage Lectio Divina in the Archdiocese, breaking open the Word, those are the kind of reflections that come forward, and they're open for anyone. And so that Exodus story is a very effective kind of a biblical analogy of some of the things we've experienced in a different way, not quite as dramatic as the Exodus in that way, but really coming to know God more, rely on Him, pray to God more, and to realize that we are a pilgrim people together, going someplace, called by someone. Very important to remember that, and that's still going on. So, Linda, I want to thank you for just spending some time with us. I really appreciate it, and your words are very encouraging, and hopefully that will also, help us think about rebuilding our communities and also the important work done by our synod. So, thank you very much, Linda, for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Linda, for sharing with us a few thoughts by way of your computer all the way from Brandon. And I want to thank all of you this morning on this Friday Report for joining us, and maybe some from outside our Archdiocese as well. And so may the Lord be with you and keep you. May He bless you and protect you and keep you safe, health-wise and spiritually. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God be with you.